Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the first lecture of our Modern European History course. Today we will begin our course preview by looking at Europe before the French Revolution, specifically the types of government that existed before the age of liberty, equality, and fraternity. The first type of government we will look at is the absolute monarchy. Under the system of absolute monarchy, the ruler of a nation, its king or queen, was decided by birth, with the eldest son of the previous monarch being first in line to the throne. What's more, absolute monarchs were, supposedly, anointed by God himself, which meant that they could do pretty much whatever they wanted. Who, after all, would be willing to risk God's wrath in the pursuit of political power down here on earth? The most famous and powerful absolute monarchy was France, whose king, at the turn of the 18th century, Louis XIV, was so powerful that it took coalitions of the rest of Europe uniting just to keep his expansion in check. The centre of power in an absolute monarchy was not parliament or a senate, but rather the royal court. Absolute monarchs were surrounded not only by dozens of aristocrats, such as dukes and counts, but also by a team of advisors, experts on matters such as finance and diplomacy. The courts were held in fabulous palaces such as Versailles in France, built at extreme cost. Absolute monarchs did not only lead their countries and could do what they wanted within them, they were considered the embodiment of the state itself. As Louis XIV noted in this famous quote, "If the king wanted something, then France itself wanted something." There was some sense of national loyalty, but this was closely tied to loyalty to the monarch themselves. France was not the only absolute monarchy in Europe, and absolute monarchies did not have to be kingdoms. Many German princes who ruled territories in the Holy Roman Empire, for example, ran their lands without any checks on their power. We'll cover the Holy Roman Empire in a separate lecture, as it's a confusing system that takes a lot of time to explain. But other absolute monarchies in Europe included Spain, Prussia, and Russia. There were some monarchies in Europe where the power of the ruler was carefully checked and controlled. In countries such as Great Britain and Poland-Lithuania, the king could not do whatever he wished, but rather had to consult the rest of the nobility. Nobles in Britain and elsewhere had united their voices in one legislative body, in the British case known as Parliament. In the 17th century, the British Parliament had gone to war with its king, Charles I, and beheaded him, an act unthinkable to absolute monarchs in Versailles and Moscow. This act, and the "Glorious Revolution," which removed Charles's son James from power, had ensured that Parliament, not the king, made important decisions over key issues such as taxation and foreign policy. In Poland-Lithuania, the king's power was kept in check by a body called the Sejm, which all nobles, or Szlachta, were entitled to be part of. The Sejm did not just check the power of the kings, but even voted for them, an extraordinary endeavour considering that a massive 10% of the Polish-Lithuanian population were nobles. This ensured that no strong monarch led the country, and that nobles were free to act pretty much as they wished, weakening Poland-Lithuania in the face of aggression from its neighbours. The bodies of nobles that kept rulers in check were not representative by any definition of the word as used today. The men who sat in Parliament and equivalent bodies throughout Europe were themselves members of a tiny elite of the richest and most powerful men, and only men, in their society. These men had no interest in introducing mass voting, and any elections that did occur were extremely corrupt, with candidates using bribery and intimidation to defeat their opponents. Imagine the Greek system of oligarchy as a guide here. Many times monarchs were condemned by nobles as absolutist or as tyrants for wanting to help the peasants and the poor, acts that nobility in parliament saw as a threat to its own wealth and power. In Italy, there existed merchant republics in city-states such as Genoa and Venice. Rich and prestigious families in these states elected their leader, the Doge, from amongst their own ranks. Over the years, the power of the Doge in these republics lessened, and by the end of the 18th century, administrators had largely replaced them in importance. The wealth of the great Italian cities had long since diminished, eclipsed by the economic might of the Caribbean colonies and the maritime trade routes to India. The lands that today form the Netherlands were, on the eve of the French Revolution, known variously as the Dutch Republic or the United Provinces. As with the merchant republics of Italy, the Dutch Republic was not a democratic state in the sense that we would understand it today. Instead, it was a coalition of numerous different provinces, such as Holland or Utrecht, each run by a leader known as a stadtholder. Not only could the same stadtholder run more than one province, the position of stadtholder was often passed down in hereditary fashion. Imagine if Governor Charlie Baker was also governor of Maine and Rhode Island, and then his kid took over from him when he died. That's the system we're talking about here. The stadtholder normally came from a prestigious family called the House of Orange, who were treated as default kings of the Netherlands by many foreigners at the time. The last form of government in 18th century Europe that we will consider today was theocratic governments. Powerful representatives of the Catholic Church, known as archbishops, continued to hold very real temporal power. The archbishops ruled their states in the same way as a minor prince would rule their own lands, taxing the peasants, building palaces, etc. Most of the European theocratic states were found in today's Germany and Italy. The largest and most powerful were the Papal States of central Italy, run by the Pope themselves. Theocracies were more common in Europe before the Protestant Reformation, after which monastic states such as the Teutonic Order converted to Protestantism and became princely states, in this case Prussia. The Protestant princes became the direct leaders of the churches in their converted states. For example, Henry VIII became the head of the Church of England, and ensured that Protestant preachers and ministers were far less powerful than the Catholic priests and bishops had once been. In Catholic states, the established church continued to exert a powerful presence, especially in deeply religious Spain. Eastern Europe also lay outside the control of the Pope in Rome. Traditionally, leaders or patriarchs of the Eastern churches had wielded an immense amount of political power. In 1721, the Russian Emperor, Peter the Great, abolished the position of patriarch and subsumed the power of the church into his own executive authority. The Russian Church and its thousands of priests now operated as agents of imperial or Tsarist rule, helping to legitimize the power of Peter's dynasty, the Romanovs. Increasingly, as the 18th century progressed, a number of freethinkers and philosophers sought to think up new forms of governance. These increasingly well-educated thinkers were inspired by a growing interest in both ancient systems of government in Greece and Rome, and an increasing awareness of natural science and the systems of logic that governed it. Men such as Jean-Jacques Rousseau wondered openly about what was logical or moral about absolute monarchy in Paris. tied as it was to an inefficient and increasingly antiquated political system. For what reason did the nobility dominate society when all humans were born without chains? New ideas were brought up in book clubs or debated in fashionable social parlours. For the time being, however, real power lay vested in the hands of the monarchs and their powerful armies. It is in this context that we should understand the American Revolution. Whilst the new nation of the United States of America was far from a full democracy, and indeed enshrined racism and slavery into its own constitution, the idea of a written constitution enshrining the rights of man appealed to Europeans suffering under the whims of their absolute rulers, corrupt parliaments, or religious leaders. In the next lecture, we will examine the concepts of nationhood and language in Europe, and how they differed from similar concepts today.